Okay, we'll just get started in a couple minutes once Hari joins. Hopefully he joins.
We'll start in 1 or 2 minutes.
I'm sorry. I totally had this started and my audio just wasn't working. So,
Yeah, Kathleen, can you make me the co-host?
Yeah, I did. I gave an introduction to Nick already, and I guess nobody heard me, and I was like talking, and no one like started anything, so that's bad. Yeah, we should
Yeah,
start
your
so
voice
that we
right now
don't
is also
have
little. Okay, I think we can start presentations group 5, and in this we have 4 presentations. So we'll start the first one, which is by Nick from Princeton, Nicholas Chickert-Levy from Princeton University, and Nick will be giving a talk on the impact of risk transfer mechanisms on smallholder farmer climate adaptation. So Nick, you can share your screen and yeah, take it forward.
Yeah, sounds good. And thanks especially, just want to reiterate thanks to Caitlin and Harry for organizing a great conference despite all the logistical difficulties. Yeah, so I'll provide a little bit of a talk on the work that we've been doing with collaborators at Princeton University and also the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna. And this is really looking at how looking at questions of climate adaptation in the agricultural sector. And it's motivated by the fact that we know that climate impacts on agriculture are likely to worsen over the latter course of the 21st century. This graphic on the bottom left is from the IPCC and shows kind of the impact that climate is likely to have on different types of crops in different parts of the world in terms of their yields. And so a key takeaway from this is that there's a lot of uncertainty. In the next couple decades, there's actually about a 50-50 split between the types of crops that are likely to see increases in crop yields versus those that are likely to see decreases in crop yields, which is represented by the orange. And so you can imagine that's a lot of uncertainty both for smallholder farmers, but also for policymakers looking to build resilience in their communities. And the second key takeaway for me from this is that there's a high risk of maladaptation. So strategies that might work in the near term, when there's kind of this 50-50 split and impacts aren't too severe one way or the other, may not be as successful later on in the 21st century as we see more of a shift towards negative and also severe impacts on crop yields. And so farmers have a variety of ways, a variety of strategies that they can use to manage these types of risks, ranging from low capital on-farm adaptation to things that are more capital intensive, and then also looking at off-farm diversification, which includes engaging in rural-urban migration and earning remittances from other types of livelihoods, which is the question that I'm especially interested in. So in this work, we have a few different research questions. I'll focus on 2 or 3 of them just for this presentation. So firstly, how does increased climate stress impact farmers' livelihood decisions, especially when there's a variety of different livelihood strategies that farmers can choose from that have different risk-reward profiles? And then secondly, we're focusing on what kind of policies, risk transfer policies, how can these kind of influence these decisions? And then I think of interest, especially for this group, how does distributed decision-making at the household scale compare to a hypothetical social planner who might be able to specify a socially optimal distribution of livelihood strategies to manage climate risk at the community scale? And so the main method I'm using to address this is to build an agent-based model. And in our model, we are creating a stylized model that's meant to represent a smallholding farming community. We have both climate and socioeconomic data from the Chitwan Valley in Nepal. And so that kind of has been used, we're using that to kind of develop a case study, but we're intentionally keeping the model stylized enough that we could hopefully apply it to different case studies as well. And so in this model, agents are individual farming households, and they seek to maximize the utility, their utility across a portfolio of adaptation strategies. And briefly, that utility function is essentially a 2-objective decision function. So the first objective is maximizing expected income from these strategies. And the second objective is minimizing expected volatility of that income. So they want to maximize expected income while minimizing risk or volatility. And each agent has different weights of how they weight those 2 objectives. And so they can choose between a set of different strategies, which include what we call business as usual, subsistence farming, which could be farming rice or wheat. That's typically relatively low cost, but also low reward. Alternatively, households can switch to cash crops, so things like legumes and fruits. Those have a higher upfront capital cost, tend to be higher expected income, but are also riskier in terms of the volatility of income that you get from those. And then finally, households can also decide to send one or more members of their household as a migrant to an urban location and earn remittances. And that tends to be in the middle of the risk-reward spectrum between these two other strategies. And so just to give a little bit more detail on the model, so we have a set of households. We place them on a small world network. So a few households have a lot of connections. The majority of households have just a few connections, which tends to be representative of a lot of networks in rural villages. And so those edges, those kind of connections are important for sharing information. So households will share information on perceived payoffs of different strategies that they've tried. If they migrate, they also help reduce the cost for other members in their network, other neighbors that might want to migrate and join them later on. And so each household kind of, and each time step goes through a decision-making process where first they compare themselves to their neighbors. If they're doing well, then they'll maintain the status quo strategy. If they're not doing well, then they'll consciously reevaluate their strategy. And so that will be a function of the information they get, a combination from their social network and from public, government information sources, and then also a function of their own risk aversion. And so households might perceive different strategies to be optimal based off of those elements. And so I mentioned we see this with data from Nepal, and we're able to kind of validate, at least for kind of the past 10 years, we have a survey that has shown how these livelihood strategies have been adopted. And so I can speak a little bit more about validation if folks are interested. But also kind of maybe one last point on optimization. And so I mentioned we wanted to see how this distributed decision-making compares to a social planner's optimal allocation. And so you can kind of think of this almost like an investor would think about investing between different portfolio strategies that each have different risk-return profiles. And so thinking about how climate impacts that going into the future, we have this objective function for the social planner that, again, is a combination of maximizing expected income, minimizing income volatility across these different strategies. And also the planner will account for covariance between related strategies. So for example, households farming similar crops, or maybe households setting a similar number of migrants, those could be considered strategies that are more correlated. And so with all things being equal, the planner wants to avoid having too much covariance in their community. I'll skip over that last part for now. And then finally, we're looking at how different policy options could impact these decisions. So I'll talk about three policies here briefly. One is index-based insurance. And so you can think about this as crop insurance, but tied to an exogenous climatic parameter. So for example, in our case, we look at if a certain drought threshold is triggered in any given time step, then all policyholders would get a pre-specified payout. We also look at remittance banks. So these can be thought of kind of on the scale of a village savings and loan association. And so for people who engage in migration, that kind of income can be pretty risky. And so thinking about how can a policy kind of pool different migrants' incomes together for a community and still allow households to get their own a portion of their own migrants' income, but also through this kind of bank, maybe pooling those together and giving everybody an expected payout, so you can kind of help smooth the migrant to migrant or time to time variation in remittance income. And then finally, we also compare this to simple cash transfers. So here we look at unconditional cash transfers, where every household gets a small amount of cash from the government in every time step to help with some cost barriers maybe to adopting these different strategies. And so I'll show just a couple of results. And so first, we can track how strategy decisions change over time. And so on these graphs, we look at x-axis is time in the model from 2006 to 2050. And then here we track how many households are adopting these different strategies, which are represented by green, which is the business as usual farming strategy. Purple is the diverse crop strategy. And then blue is the number of households engaging in migration. And we can compare the model without climate impacts to what happens if we model the effect of a 1.5 degree C rise in temperature. And so that's linked to decreases in crop yields, as well as increasing frequency of extreme droughts, which we kind of sample stochastically in the model. And what we can see is that these climate impacts actually reduce the number of households that switch to alternative strategies, especially the diverse cropping strategy, but also the number of households who migrate compared to the counterfactual without climate impacts. And this has an impact on economic outcomes. So just to mention a couple here, we see a decrease in average income, which is represented by the green line from a scenario with climate impacts to a scenario without climate impacts, and also a slight decrease in the number of migrants. especially from primary educated households, which is represented by the green shaded bar. I didn't get into too many details, but basically we relate educational status to things like risk aversion and wealth, which impact your ability to cope with climate strategies. And so we can see that come through in the model. And so finally, I'll end with a couple results on policy impacts. So here we're looking at different policy cases and how this impacts strategy decisions. And so those are represented by the bars. Purple is diverse cropping strategy, green is the business as usual strategy, and blue is the number of households that migrate. And so this shows kind of how many households are adopting each strategy by the end of the time frame under different policy cases. And then the orange bar represents the social utility that's perceived by the social planner. And so what we can see is that each policy has an impact in increasing the number of households that adopt these kind of higher risk, higher reward strategies, and especially a combination of all three. So a small cash transfer with risk transfer policies are able to help the most households adopt these other strategies. And it also increases the social utility perceived by the social planner. But there's still quite a gap, even with these policies, even with the combination of all three, there's still a gap between what the social planner would want and what emerges through decentralized decision-making. I'll skip these in the interest of time, but just to show that we also track the impact on income and inequality. And again, each policy has some impact. A combination of all three kind of leads to the best outcome. And we also looked at different climate scenarios, and which policy is the most effective depends on the climate scenario. I can go into more details if folks are interested. I'll just end with kind of further directions and maybe a call or invitation to collaboration. So I'm not very well versed in machine learning. I've gotten a lot out of these conferences, but I'm definitely not an expert. And I'd love to work with anybody who maybe has expertise and interest in dynamic policy controls. So how can we have maybe reinforcement learning or some other type of dynamic control to match the policy to the optimal outcome based off of changing climatic and socioeconomic conditions? There's also more complex optimization, looking at maybe lumpier strategies, things that you invest in one time step, but only pay out maybe over 10 or 15 time steps. And then finally, I'm really interested in looking at remittance data sets to look at, I think there's a possibility for having kind of pretty big data on remittance flows from different parts of the world and seeing how this is tied to different climatic conditions at both the source and destination. So again, thanks everybody for your participation and attention. And we'd love to follow up with people now or offline.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And any questions for Nick? Okay,
Nick,
if not,
a great presentation. I have a question on, like, even with the all three policies, there is still a pretty large gap in the social utility. I was wondering if you can talk a little more if there are any potential policy proposals that could close that gap, or in your mind, like the decentralized idea is not the way to go. There probably need to be something more top-down to get to that social utility.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Minghao. I think two things really quickly. One is this is done in a really dumb way right now where we have static policies that last for many years. And I think maybe having policies that are more flexible and can change over time might help. But I think the big thing is that the social planner cares about correlative strategies, whereas households don't account for that in their decision-making. And so if there is a way for policies to kind of account for that correlation and incentives they provide to individual households, I think maybe that can help close the social utility gap a bit more.
I wanted to ask about your the objectives you were talking about. So you mentioned that you're trying to maximize income for the farmer, but then also minimize volatility. But what if volatility could be like positive volatility, like with certain, because I think you also showed that you had that map at the beginning of like the orange and the blue, where orange was like decrease in yield and then blue was increase in yield. So it does seem that like climate change will cause yields to increase for some farmers. So is there a way to think of volatility only like negative volatility?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lily. I'd love to, if folks have interest or experience working in this, I'd love to think more about it. I think there is the potential for like volatility to be good, and we don't account for that right now. You're right, in our objective function. One psychological model would be like thinking about loss aversion. So maybe one objective would be like just looking at losses and including that, which we haven't accounted for yet. But I think there is also some research that in general, smallholder farmers are generally averse to risk, including potentially positive volatility. So yeah, thinking about how to weight those, like maybe still having that volatility thing, but also specifically accounting for losses separately might be interesting to get around that.
Really cool work.
Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Our next speaker is Arjun Chandrasekhar from University of Pittsburgh. And Arjun will be giving a talk on neural arbors are Pareto optimal.
Great. So thanks for the introduction, and I'd like to thank Caitlin and the rest of the committee for the invite. So I'll get into it. So this talk is not necessarily going to be directly about sustainability in the way the other talks are. More, I'm going to present on some of the work that I've done, and hopefully I can see if maybe this work is of interest to any potential collaborators. So my research focuses on the area of biological distributed computing or biological distributed algorithms. So I do some works that using computer science to study biology, but the main thrust of my work is the other way around, using biology to study computer science. So we in nature see a lot of examples of organisms that are able to solve some really complex challenges, such as finding a path from a nest to a food source, or getting into an advantageous flying formation, or finding the optimal way to forage through an area, in insect colonies and birds and in slime molds and in a lot of other biological species. So what's really interesting about these species is that they don't have the luxury of being able to use the kind of central processing computers that we use in the algorithms that we care about. But instead, they've had to evolve solutions that rely on distributed computing, in which individual agents can only use limited local communication, but collectively you see some really elegant emergent properties and just high-level collective behavior. So I'm really interested in seeing how these systems are able to solve optimization problems using distributed computing. I've spent a lot of my time studying ant colonies and arboreal ant colonies, but today I'm going to be talking about how neural arbors solve problems related to coming up with optimal transportation networks, and maybe we'll see some similarities between my work and other work. So a neuron consists of a cell body and dendrites and an axon. So the dendrites are used to receive signal from upstream partners and transmit them to the cell body. And then the axon is used to transmit a signal from the cell body to downstream partners. And we see quite a bit of diversity in the morphological properties of different neurons. So we see you can look at 3 different arbors and you can get completely different structures for how the axons and dendrites are wired to connect the cell body to all of the different synaptic partners. For example, if we look at 3 different pyramidal cells, we see quite a bit of diversity in how these arbors are structured. And in grad school, I wanted to understand what design principles were driving these kinds of morphological differences. So there have been 2 well-studied design principles that have been proposed for how neural arbors attempt to wire the cell body in connection to all the synapses. The principle of conduction delay states that the arbor wants to minimize how much time it takes to transmit a signal from the cell body to all of the different synapses. And the principle of wiring cost states that the arbor wants to minimize the total amount of material needed to connect everything, but while still maintaining a structure that allows you to get from the cell body to every possible synaptic partner. Now, in general, it's impossible to minimize both of these simultaneously. If you only cared about minimizing the conduction delay, you would connect the cell body in a straight line to every synapse, but this would be very inefficient in terms of material cost. If you minimize material cost, you would optimize that wiring principle, but you might have some synapses that are very close to the cell body physically, but the path to the synapse is quite long. Or you could do something in the middle where maybe you're not optimal for either objective, but you manage to find a good trade-off between the 2. And so my hypothesis was that evolution and natural selection would have driven neurons to find optimal, in particular Pareto optimal trade-offs between these 2 objectives. I proposed that over time, neurons would have evolved into morphologies such that you can't necessarily you can't improve either objective both objectives at the same time, but rather if you improve one objective, you would be losing something with the other. So my question was, do neurons actually form Pareto optimal trade-offs between these 2 objectives? So anecdotally, yes. I looked at several different neural arbors and I computed what were the optimal topologies these neural arbors could have done and what did the neural arbors actually do. And I found that neural arbors come pretty close to optimizing the trade-off between wiring cost and conduction delay. But rather than just show you these anecdotal examples, I'll show you some statistical evidence. So comparing neural arbors to 3 different null models, or 3 different kind of randomly constructed random graph models that don't care about optimizing conduction delay or wiring cost, I found the neural arbors form much more optimal morphologies than you would expect by chance if you were not really caring about optimizing either objective. So based on all this evidence, it stands to reason the neural arbors are have kind of evolved some sort of algorithm to find some Pareto optimal trade-off between wiring cost and conduction delay. So the reason I'm telling all of you this is going forward, one of my interests is trying to figure out how neural arbors use distributed computation to actually form optimal trade-offs between these 2 objectives. But in particular of interest for maybe the CompSust cohort, can a neural arbor inspired algorithm be used to design public transport networks that efficiently manage the trade-off between getting people to where they want quickly and saving on the material that you need to actually build out the network? And even at a more immediate level, I'd be interested in studying if anyone has the data on whether human designed transportation networks are Pareto optimal at all, or if we can improve them. So please let me know if you'd like to collaborate. I'd like to thank everyone that helped me out in grad school, particularly my advisors, Saket Navlaka and University of California, San Diego. I'd like to thank Pitt for giving me a job, and I'd like to thank Caitlin for inviting me here, and the rest of you. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
How is the distance from the Pareto front computed? There's a couple ways you can do it. I don't know what your method, I don't know what the hypervolume is, but I'm sure it's much more complicated than what I did. You can actually just compute, you can measure the cost of all of your optimal networks and the cost of your neural network. And you compute the Euclidean distance from the neural costs to the closest point on the Pareto front. And then I did, in the paper that I'm happy to show you, I did something a little bit different that was more robust to variations in the size of neural arbors, but those were the 2 methods that I used. I'd be happy to discuss that more offline.
Okay, great. Thanks for the answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Arjun.
Another question. Yeah. What kind of transport networks data are you looking at? Like, is this, for example, like, if you're looking at maybe like metro data, then it's easier to collect, but like, do you have any constraints on that? Or?
No, I haven't even tried looking at transit data. I'm just kind of here to see if anyone else has data that they'd like to analyze. And it doesn't just have to be transit data, just kind of any sort of network data. I'd be interested in seeing if how different networks form trade-offs between different optimization principles.
Awesome. Cool.
Actually, you know what? I will amend that. For the model that I used, one constraint is that you do need to have a pre-designated cell body. So you need to have some sort of route for your network, maybe like a really important downtown hub or something.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really helps. Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Arjun. So we'll move to our next speaker, who is Matthew B. Brusson. Who is from CMU, and Matthew will be giving a talk on optimization of ride-hailing electrification considering emission costs.
Thanks for the introduction. Just to confirm, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So thanks for organizing this. This has been a really great chance to learn about other people's cool work. Today I'm going to give a brief summary of some work that I did with my advisors, Jeremy Mahalik at Carnegie Mellon and Inej Azevedo at Stanford, looking at electrification of ride-hailing fleets such as Uber and Lyft, and how that optimization changes when you consider the costs of emissions. Within the US, transportation is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. As of 2018, I think, it overtook electricity. And within transportation, ride-hailing services such as Uber and Lyft have doubled as a share of total passenger trips in the last 10 years. IPCC and other people have said that passenger transport needs to be fully electrified to meet climate goals. In response to that, we've seen some state-level regulations, and Uber and Lyft both also have announced goals to shift their fleets to 100% EV. We know that one motivation for this is that electric vehicles, while it depends on regional variations, they almost always reduce emissions relative to gasoline combustion, especially in urban areas where cars do a lot of idling and stop and go traffic. And electricity is also cheaper usually relative to gasoline. But we also know that batteries are very expensive. So there are some capital cost versus operational cost trade-offs. And there are also operational constraints related to recharging. In particular, if you have to take a car offline to charge, you might need more total vehicles to meet the same amount of demand. So our goal in this study is to jointly optimize these longer term investment decisions along with the minute-by-minute dispatch and routing of the fleet. Our main research question is what mixture of technologies, meaning gasoline versus hybrid versus battery or electric powertrains, might be optimal for these fleets. And also, and equally importantly, to consider whether that optimal strategy changes if the fleet also considers the cost of emissions, looking both at health damages as well as climate change impacts. We have two versions of the optimization. In one version, the fleet is minimizing capital plus energy plus maintenance costs. And in the second version, they're also considering those external costs that I mentioned. This is a mixed integer problem. And what we're able to do is compare the results from these two scenarios to identify a policy gap. Today, I won't go into full detail on the formulation, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it. Essentially, it's a cost minimization MIP, considering network flow, demand constraints, as well as vehicle purchase constraints. We also have a separate set of constraints that are optimally scheduling vehicle charging, considering how emissions vary throughout the course of the day. These are what make the problem really hard to scale. So we have some customized heuristics that we use to solve interesting scales of problems. We look across 3 different cities, considering variations in things like energy costs. And one of our primary results looks at the fraction of the fleet's total vehicle miles traveled that are served by battery vehicles. So what you can see here is that across Austin, New York, and Los Angeles, adding a tax on emissions consistently increases the electrification. It doesn't increase by as much in Los Angeles, simply because it's already optimal to use a lot of battery vehicles. But in cities like Austin that have lower gasoline prices, battery vehicle usage more than doubles. We were also interested in seeing how much of an impact that actually makes in reducing overall emissions. And what you can see in this set of results is that across cities, emissions do always reduce when you electrify more, but the decrease ranges from 12 to 31%. This depends partly on the power grid mix. It also depends on things like population density, where more people or fewer people might be affected by that pollution. And third, we see that even when a fleet is already fully electrified, there are some additional reductions in emissions that can be found through optimal scheduling of battery charging throughout the course of the day. So to summarize these results, we do see there's a policy gap here where policies may be warranted to increase electrification. But having said that, the optimal fleet is almost always a mixture of technologies, not only battery vehicles, but also hybrid, and in some situations, conventional combustion vehicles. So what this means is when designing policies, it's important to consider regional variations. I'd like to thank my funders and my advisors, and I'm also happy to take any questions either now or offline. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Any questions from Matthew? Okay, if not, our next speaker is Aruna Sankar Narayanan from MIT, and Aruna will be speaking about reducing the world with OSM tag stats. Aruna, I'll let you share the screen. Aruna, you're muted.
One second. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. So my name is Aruna, and I am a student at the MIT Media Lab. Currently, my research is not super relevant to computational sustainability, but I have like a really huge like personal interest in this area. And today I'm going to be talking about this library. It's a super high-level talk. It's just about this library that I built a couple of years ago because I have a strong interest in just like computational geography and geospatial data and how to build distributed systems to analyze it and so on. So this library actually is just a super scalable and very fast approach to querying OpenStreetMap data. And I'll be talking about why it's relevant to researchers like you and me and how you all can use this library to get the data. So firstly, I don't know how many of you have heard of OpenStreetMap, but OpenStreetMap is kind of like the largest living map of the world. It's very similar to Google Maps, except that all of the data is open and free, and the data comes from volunteers. So literally anybody can add data to the map. And I know I think one analogy that I like to use, it's kind of like a Wikipedia for maps. So it's completely based off of crowdsourced information. And I'm sure that many of you are thinking, oh, in that case, like how good is the quality and is it quality assured and so on. So I think one thing that differentiates OpenStreetMap is that there's companies like Apple, Facebook, Mapbox, and even Microsoft that invest heavily into like using OpenStreetMap in their own maps. And they contribute heavily to the project. So there's a lot of interest, commercial interest in the project as well to make the data of much better quality. And the data is extremely structured, and each geographical feature has a ton of metadata. So highways will have maybe the number of lanes, whether the surface of the highway is paved or paved. And it's just like a massive amount of geospatial data collected over the last 11 or 12 years. So what is the motivation really for, people like computer scientists to be using this data? Well, firstly, the diversity of the metadata associated with geographical features on OpenStreetMap is really high. So this is just a sampling of some of the tags on OpenStreetMap features. And you can see, things like leaf cycle, which are added to trees. You can see more common ones like highways and buildings. You have segregated, which I think is probably referencing like neighborhoods. So there are people constantly devising new metadata tags that can be added to the database. And there's also nonprofit organizations. One of them is the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. And these folks are constantly adding data to resource-deprived areas like India and Africa. So, if there is a disaster that happens in one of these areas where there's not good quality map data, a bunch of volunteers will immediately gather to map out the area. And in fact, organizations like the Red Cross use map data that's generated from these, maps when they're in relief works. So, for example, in the paper that Ritwik, who spoke yesterday, where he was talking about, assessing building damage from satellite imagery, I think they use human annotators to assess where the buildings were in the picture. But it's quite likely that this data would have already been present in OpenStreetMap because for pretty much every disaster that happens, there's volunteers that sit and map the features on the satellite imagery. So before I talk to you about what the library does and why it's so scalable and fast, I just wanted to give you like a small primer on web maps. So web maps are actually present in many different formats. And the format that, is most familiar to us when we look at Google Maps or any other map on our phone is the Web Mercator format, which is actually not what the world looks like at all. So the sizes are stretched weirdly, and just the projection is to ensure that you have a 2D representation of the weird shape that the Earth is. And the data is tiled. So this is why, the map is fast, even on your phone, because at any given point, when you're looking at your phone, it's just retrieving data for the bounding box that you're looking at, and also only at the detail that you're requesting. So if you zoom into your phone, you'll notice that you get like different data, and if you swipe really fast, you'll notice these squares of data that appear. And all of these tiles are actually of two forms. So you have raster tiles, which are your traditional like satellite imagery or any sort of like tile that contains the actual image pixels. But you also have vector tiles. So most of your web maps will actually use vector tiles where they're only retrieving the metadata or the vector data associated with the tile or the geographical data with the tile from the server, but they construct the rasterization on your browser or on your client. So in this particular case, like the tile that you see is a raster tile, but it's been generated on the client, and the vector data will have, all of the geographical coordinates for each of these highways and maybe like metadata for what this green patch is. Is it a forest? Is it a field? Is this a river? Is this a highway? Things like that. So if you really want to imagine it, a web map is basically just a giant single quadrant Cartesian grid, which has many slots for vector tiles. And the way that the tile representation works is that each tile is represented by three values, the Z, X, and the Y. The Z represents the zoom level. So, at lower zoom levels, you'll be able to see lesser data or like coarser data. And at higher zoom levels, you'll see more fine resolution data. And the X represents the longitude and the Y represents the latitude. And at any given zoom level, the map has 2 power 2n tiles. So, as you go to higher zoom levels or you're looking at finer resolution data or you just want to know all of the details, you're going to be processing many, many, many more tiles. So another visual representation is how quickly the tile sizes grow. At zoom 0, you have the entire world basically on one single tile. And it's impossible, I think, for like a single processor to process all of, or at least a single processor on our computers to process this entire like massive piece of information in one shot. At zoom level 1, the single tile at zoom 0 is broken up into 4 more tiles. And at subsequent zoom levels, each of those tiles is broken up into 4 more tiles. So at zoom level 3, each of these tiles is broken into 4 more tiles and you'll have 16 tiles. So the way that OSM DAGstats works is it basically applies this concept of map reduce on tiles, but you don't really need any like fancy Hadoop or any of those things. You can use just your computer, and it uses this library called tile reduce. And what tile reduce did was that it used inherent socket processes on your computer. So depending on the number of CPU cores on your computer, you can have those many workers. And each worker will asynchronously and in parallel process a tile at any given point of time. So, if you have like 8 CPUs, CPU cores on your machine, you could, be processing 8 tiles in parallel and asynchronously. And the order in which, as I mentioned, it's asynchronous. So the order in which you process the tiles is not super important. And the way it works is you give it, vector tiles in a compressed form. So generally, if you have CSV data, if you have GeoJSON data, basically you have data where you have the metadata, but also the geographical information or the geometric information associated with the feature. You can convert all of those formats to this Mapbox tiles format or the MB tiles format. And there are open source libraries that allow you to do this. And once you have these compressed vector tiles, you just give it open OSM DAGstats, and you also give it like data filters. And these data filters can be as granular or as like high level as you want them to be. So for example, you could simply look for all of the primary highways in OpenStreetMap, or you could look for something super specific, like only the buildings that have 3 levels in the map. And I guess like one caveat is just that the data in OpenStreetMap, though in many areas, is actually much better quality than Google Maps. It's also important to remember that the data is as good as the community in that area. So sometimes, you may not you won't get this level of data where you have the buildings and the levels marked for the entire world, but it's definitely available in many geographical areas. And you provided these 2 values, you could give it an optional bounding box if you only want to query within a specific area. And it gives you the extracted results. It also gives you, if you want the count of the data. And every day you get these compressed vector tiles for the entire world and per country in this particular website. So this is, pre-generated for you, and it's updated daily. So you could, actually conduct day level analysis if you're looking to see how the world is changing and how it's changing on OpenStreetMap. So I would just like to end by showing you this video of a quick OSM tagstats process, and you can see the number of tiles it's processing to find out all the roundabouts in the world. So the filter for this just had a filter for the roundabouts, and so it's processing like, yeah, nearly a million. And I mean, according to like my personal estimates, like I could process all of the buildings in the world, like extract and count all the buildings that were mapped on OpenStreetMap for the entire world in 20 minutes on my computer. So yeah, I just hope that more of you can use it, because this is, in some places, like especially in Europe, data is really rich. And I think it can, definitely be used to augment many of your data sets. And I hope it's useful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Aruna. I think this tool seems really interesting. And does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. What are the outputs? Like, if you have like all the roundabouts in the world, is it like a set of just points, or are there like polygons, or like what's coming out of it?
You get basically the GeoJSON. So it has the metadata associated with the feature and also the geographical information, the geometric information.
Cool.
So if you extracted the data and you put it somewhere, you could visualize all of the roundabouts in the world.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other question? Okay, if not, we'll have a stretch break right now, and we'll be back at 3:25 p.m. Eastern time. So when we're back, we'll start the presentation group 6, and then we have tutorials and a lot of things. So be back by 3:25 p.m. Hi, let's get started with our next presentations group. And in this group, we have 7 talks, and we'll start this group by the talk from Thomas Hartvigsen, who is from WPI, and Thomas will be talking about adaptive halting policy networks for early classification. So Thomas, can you please share your screen?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right. Super. All right. Thanks. Thanks everybody, and thank you to the organizers for making this event happen. So my talk is adaptive halting policy networks for early classification, and the goal of this this talk is to introduce you all to the problem of early classification of time series. And so let's get started. Just move this. Okay, so time series classification problems are widespread and are particularly prevalent in time-sensitive decision-making situations. So like a prime example of this is in intensive care units, which has to do with a lot of the work we've done in our group. But basically, in some cases, we might be observing a patient's vital signs or something over time. And we basically want to come to conclusions about the patient's condition as quickly as possible, because we basically like can't make our predictions too late. So in this scenario, we're basically observing data over time, and we have to come to conclusions based on the data as quickly as possible. And so in this sort of scenario, the time at which a machine learning classifier actually makes its predictions both impacts the accuracy of the predictions and the usefulness of said predictions. And so a nice example of this is in predicting hospital-acquired infections to reduce the use of antibiotics unnecessarily, particularly in at-risk populations in intensive care units. And so basically, if you wait too long to make an accurate prediction that a patient is going to get a certain infection, then the doctor can't actually use that prediction. But if you make a prediction too early, you haven't seen enough information to actually make a good prediction. And so at its core, this question is like an age-old question of how much data do we actually need to collect in order to be confident about a classification. And for time series, this is the problem of early classification. And so specifically, the problem of early classification of time series is assume that we're given some records collected over time. So for instance, it might be a patient's vital signs and a classification task for, say, our patient. So perhaps we're given their vital signs over time, and we want to predict whether or not the patient is going to remain in stable condition or become critical. And the key idea in this setting is that we want to generate this prediction while using as few time steps as possible. And basically, by using fewer time steps, we leave more and more time for a user to actually react to this classification. So in our simple example, if you're able to predict that a patient is going to go into a critical condition, basically, if you don't give the doctor enough time to react, you can't actually avoid it as effectively. And this is a sort of gratuitously high-level example, but hopefully it gets the point across. And so specifically on the data side, the problem is to pick a time step at which we return the classification for the entire time series, and thereby we sort of disregard all future data. And in practice, this time step is going to be different according to the time series that you're actually working with, because it depends on when the signals of the classification class actually arrive. And so to summarize the problem, a good early classifier is going to predict the accurate label for an entire time series while using as few time steps as possible. So these are sort of two different contradictory goals, which I'll get into in a minute. But this is a very helpful problem to solve in a lot of different situations. So the example I was alluding to actually comes from a KDD paper from this year, where basically the authors are trying to predict whether or not post-operative children in a cardiac intensive care unit are going to become go into critical condition, or if they're going to remain stable. But another really interesting example was brought up in a different 2017 paper, not my work, but somebody else, where they're basically using in the wild audio data to identify rare birds in a particular area while using as little audio data as possible. So I guess inform people of which bird species are moving through an area soon enough to react to that information. So this is a hard problem for a variety of reasons, but three of which, but I'm just going to list three. The first challenge is that we typically assume that the proper time to stop and make an early classification is generally unknown. So we only have access to a time series and its associated label during training. We never actually know that you should have actually stopped at a particular time step. So that part is unsupervised. The second challenge is, like I mentioned before, earliness and accuracy, which are our two goals, are typically contradictory. And this is pretty intuitive. Like if you're trying to predict a patient's condition, if you generate your prediction right when they walk into the hospital, then you give the doctor all the time in the world to react to your totally wrong prediction. Whereas if you wait up until the last second, then you are going to be as right as you can be, but you don't leave enough time. So the optimal balance lives somewhere in between these two cases, and that the proper balance depends on the task at hand. And then finally, in the multivariate case, when you have different evidence for your classification task arriving at different times, you have to come up with some sort of a model that is able to sort of put together evidence from possibly very different timescales in order to do the classification. So the standard approach to solving early classification problems, they all sort of fall into one general category where we have two components. The first is a time series prefix classifier, which is just to say, like, given time series recorded up to a certain point, generate a classification. And this is pretty standard supervised learning. And so most of the focus in early classification comes from the second component, which is to figure out some sort of a halting policy. That is to say, I've seen time series up until a certain point. Should I stop and generate my classification now, or should I wait for more data? And so basically, the way they work is at every new observation you make in your time series, you look at the data, you make your halting decision, and that halting decision is either wait for more data or stop and predict. So basically, if you say wait for more data, you wait one more time step, and then you do the same thing again. And at some point, you've seen enough information, you choose to stop, and you apply your time series prefix classifier. So most of the recent work that's been done in this domain of early classification of time series has focused on the idea of like tunability between the two contrasting goals of earliness and accuracy, under the assumption that the proper trade-off, again, is task dependent. And so we want to provide a user with the ability to say, like, I care this much about earliness and I care this much about accuracy, under the intuition that like really dangerous infections or something like COVID, it's okay to sacrifice some accuracy, so we might get some more false positives as long as we're catching things earlier on average. And so within this world, we've done a little bit of work in my group. And so for instance, we published a paper at KDD last year and another one at this year working on early classification. And some of the key contributions are a sort of new framework for a new architecture for solving these types of problems, which provides a really easy way to add this tunability, because we basically one of the early approaches to actually use deep learning, and so we could very explicitly have a loss function that just balances our two goals. And we were amongst the first groups to, or first works to do learnable halting policy. And the main idea of how we solve it is extremely intuitive. We basically treat the problem of early classification as a Markov decision process. In implementation, it's often solved as a partially observable Markov decision process, but the key idea is really simple. At every time step, we are going to observe more data. We represent our values however we want, and then we take an action, either stop and generate a prediction now or wait for more data, and basically observe like what happens when you do different policies and see what happens in order to train the model. And so the general architecture that we use is pretty modular, and we very gratuitously named it earliest, which is like quite a stretch of an acronym. But
Thomas, you have 1 more minute.
Okay, cool, thank you. Yeah, but the key idea is we take an RNN, it's reading our time series, and then we have like a little reinforcement learning based agent that sits on top and makes this halting decision that's optimized for the trade-off between earliness and accuracy. So I'm gonna just skip. We basically evaluate it by just showing the trade-off between them. And in our work, we basically show that our methods are able to make earlier predictions more accurately. And I'll skip to the conclusions, which is basically by jointly optimizing earliness and accuracy, we can provide tunability to this problem really easily. But probably more importantly, the problem setting itself is broadly extendable, and the solution that we provide is also pretty extendable. So for instance, we took it into the multi-label setting in a KDD paper this year, basically under the intuition that a lot of classifications can be better framed as multi-label problems. So for instance, patients often have multiple conditions at the same time, and which conditions they have are going to be correlated to each other. And similarly, in the bird species identification problem, we might want to identify which species are all together in a particular area, and the species that you see are often going to be correlated because they sort of appear in groups at a large level. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you to my collaborators, Jensu and professors Elke Rundensteiner and Xingnan Kong.
Great, thanks, Thomas. Any questions?
Thank you.
Okay, if not, our next speaker is going to be Aaron Ferber from University of Southern California, and Aaron will be discussing about differentiable optimal adversaries for learning fair representations. Aaron, I'll let you share the screen.
Okay. Let me set up. Okay, desktop. Sorry, it's not working for some reason. Let me see. Desktop 2. Share. Is it working now?
Yep.
Oh.
Oh, it just disappeared.
Sorry. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So, hi, I'm Aaron. I'm a PhD student at USC, and today I'll be talking about joint work with Umang Gupta, Greg Versteeg, and Vishra Dilkina on learning fair feature representations with differentiable optimization. So given machine learning's growing appearance in sensitive domains, like in finance, healthcare, and predictive policing, it's more important than ever to build machine learning tools with fairness in mind. In fact, we have a lot of legal requirements that ensure people get equal access to housing, education, credit, and more. These laws and ethical considerations generally want to ensure that everyone has access to these different needs, regardless of protected status like race, religion, or genetic information. That means we need to make sure our machine learning models are fair. And so as many of you may know, there are many different potentially conflicting definitions of fairness, like individual and group fairness. But in this work, we're just going to take a look at demographic parity, which is the notion that a model should not give better predictions for one group over another. Also, many of those laws that I talked about previously express unfairness in terms of demographic parity difference. So that's why we'll concentrate on that. And so in practice, we have this neural network. We train it with some features and labels, potentially encoding that sensitive class. And then we are going to evaluate some unfairness metric of the model. And here we're going to look at how the model outputs differ between groups, which corresponds to the demographic parity difference. And the goal is to maximize the predictive performance of the neural network while minimizing the unfairness metric. And along these lines, we took a look at framework in adversarial representation learning, where fairness is measured by a worst case accuracy adversary. So here the goal is to train an embedding which doesn't expose sensitive features in the learned representation. So overall, how we're going to determine that is we're going to train another model like logistic regression to try to extract the sensitive information from the learned features. And so the worse that fully trained adversary does, the better we are at hiding that sensitive information. In practice, we want to ensure that even that fully trained model can't extract like race or genetic information from the learned features. And this means we could potentially share these fair features and no one can use that sensitive information. So our approach for fair representation learning will be to ensure this good classification while penalizing the embedding based off fully trained adversary. And what we're going to do is we're going to formulate the adversary training procedure as a differentiable component in our neural network. So when we call our sklearn.fit, we want to be able to differentiate through that fitting method. And overall, we need to figure out how do changes in the adversary parameters how are they affected by changes in the embeddings? So in our diagram for the forward pass, this bottom row is kind of your standard neural network. You compute embeddings based off some features. Then you compute some target classification based off those embeddings. And then this top row is going to compute the unfairness metric. So here we're going to compute that worst case logistic regression and then apply that to the embeddings to get some adversarial loss. So now most of these components are differentiable except for this sklearn.fit method. We don't really have easy gradients for figuring out how do changes in the parameters, how are they affected by changes in the embeddings. But what we can do is we can kind of use some calculus to figure that out. And so the idea is overall, since logistic regression is convex, we set the gradient equal to 0, and we can solve that system of equations to get these implicitly defined gradients. And so by doing that and working out this math, we can get potentially better work. So we compare against several standard adversarial learning approaches, these ones over here, which basically don't do that calculus step that I talked about previously. But the main problem of these adversarial approaches are the problems that appear in GAN-like settings where they have problems with training stability and model quality. And they're usually being trained against under-trained adversaries at every iteration, so they may not be that great. So overall, we evaluate on 4 real-world data sets to determine our fairness. And since the metrics, since this is inherently multi-objective problem, trading off accuracy and our fairness metric, we compute the best target accuracy at a given fairness threshold for several fairness thresholds. And we use 2 different fairness metrics, the accuracy of that worst case adversary and the demographic parity difference. That's kind of the legal thing that we need to observe. We get good results. A lot of these bolded lines are ours. And yeah, so the main takeaways are that machine learning problems are optimization problems too. We can kind of treat them as optimization problems in terms of sklearn.fit in order to differentiate through them. And also training this pipeline end-to-end gives us better performance for the same fairness limits. And so let me know if you have any questions on this or implicit differentiation. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. Any questions for Aaron? Sorry. Okay, if not, our next speaker is Katin Morrison from University of Pittsburgh. And Katin will be giving a talk on evaluating the fairness of bike sharing programs with geospatial analysis.
Perfect. That was a good leeway from Aaron's talk, actually, I think. So hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Morrison, and I am a senior undergraduate at the University of Pittsburgh. I have recently been investigating the fairness within socio-technical systems, such as smart mobility and the machine learning algorithms that are applied to them. But recently, I evaluated the fairness of the Pittsburgh bike sharing program using geospatial analysis. Oops. I'd like to preface with a definition and examples of smart mobility first. So smart mobility includes mobility systems that are on demand and dynamic, where their availability and frequency relies on predicted demand. Some examples of these smart mobility systems include bike sharing programs, car sharing programs, and ride sharing programs. And smart mobility programs and initiatives are mainly motivated to reduce traffic congestion, which ultimately reduces air pollution. Also, it increases the quality of life, and it's meant to provide affordable and accessible transportation to all. So in terms of smart mobility and accessibility, many smart mobility programs have been implemented within cities to broaden the possible modes of transportation. But these programs require users to have a smartphone and sometimes even a credit card account. It has also been observed by several studies that many of the offerings are not distributed evenly. For example, these smart mobility systems can be found near bike trails, and they can also be found commonly in upper and middle class neighborhoods. The even distribution, clearly, and fairness of offering these modes of transportation are imperative to providing all social classes access to the job market, reliable access to the job market. So Considering the definition of fairness for smart mobility systems, Ann Yan and Bill Howe from the University of Washington state fairness in their recent publication, Fair ST, as the requirement that individuals of different demographic groups receive equal amount of mobility resources. However, in my case study, I evaluated the fairness of the bike sharing program in Pittsburgh a little differently. I used 3 features to evaluate it. The first feature was the percentage of poor housing conditions by census tract, and this just represents the percentage of residential buildings that are in poor condition, which was provided by the Allegheny County and the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center. The second feature I used was the number of stations in each neighborhood, and the third was the capacity of each bike station, which is the number of bikes that you can have at each bike station. So overall, after mapping this out, for reference, the locations of bike stations here are in pink, and the percentage of poor housing is in a shade of blue, and the very faint yellow line is actually on-street bike routes in Pittsburgh. So the first observation made is the huge grouping of stations that are downtown and along the Strip District, which is this area here, a very popular shopping area. And the second observation made is all of the grouping of bike stations that are on the university campuses for Pitt and CMU. But more importantly, you can clearly see the neighborhoods with poor housing have very few bike stations, and I'll just show a couple here. So despite the on-street bike routes running through these neighborhoods, out of the 100 bike stations in Pittsburgh through Healthy Ride, only 5 of them are represented in neighborhoods with poor housing conditions. So that means only 5% of them are allocated to low-income neighborhoods. In the future, I think planners of bike sharing programs and smart mobility systems in general should try to explore more regions that they have not before, which opens the door for potentially using Bayesian optimization as it puts the program planners in an exploration versus exploitation problem when determining where to distribute these mobility resources that will result in a lot of usage, because a lot of machine learning algorithms are used to predict demand and find the best location for the stations. Overall, such challenges as predicting demand of the station and identifying locations while reducing discrimination should continue to be researched in the future to improve traffic congestion and the balance of accessibility of these vital resources amongst social classes. Thank you. If you have any questions or are interested in collaborating, please email me or message me in the Slack. That's all I have.
I have a question. Oh, that's pretty cool. I was wondering if you know, like, if there are outages that are kind of unfairly distributed, like in certain neighborhoods that are underrepresented, is there like more outage, like there are no bikes there or no docks available, something like that?
Yeah, so my future work with this is to analyze the trends of the capacity of the bike stations to see, because they may have, like these 5 neighborhoods do have 5 stations, but are they ever full of bikes? So that's one of my next research directions, because that's a part of demand prediction and redistributing the bikes.
Cool.
Great question.
Great. Any other question for Kathleen?
Are you exploring different bike sharing programs or only one?
Currently, I've only looked at Pittsburgh's bike sharing program. Oh, I've also looked at the bike sharing program in St. Louis and Manizales, because Manizales, Colombia, I was supposed to do research there this last summer. But St. Louis is a unique example as well. So I haven't had data from them, though. I would love to collaborate if you have data on them.
Great. Any other question? Okay. Thanks, Kathleen. And our next speaker is MD Naseem from Purdue University. And Naseem will be giving a talk on machine learning for material defect analysis with minimal human input.
Can I share my screen?
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and try. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about my work on using machine learning for analyzing defects in materials. This work is being done in collaboration between the computer science and the material science department at Purdue University. My name is Nasim, and I'm a PhD student at Purdue Computer Science. I'll try to keep this talk at a super duper high level because we have only 5 minutes. But you have any interest about this, we can talk more afterwards. So that, let's get started. So our work is motivated by the importance of nuclear power to build a sustainable clean energy future. Nuclear power right now is the second largest low carbon power source in the world and generates about 10% of the world's total electricity production. It's also one of the safest in the sense that it has caused less number of fatalities per unit energy produced compared to coal, gas, and hydropower. One of the problems, though, with these nuclear power plants is that they have limited lifespan and they degrade over time. So according to the International Energy Agency, this limited lifespan, which could result in the closing of the existing power plants, and the lack of new ones could result into a huge amount of carbon dioxide being emitted into our atmosphere. And this could be like as much as like 4 billion tons in the upcoming future. So to increase this limited lifetime and build sustainable power plants, we need better alloys. By better, I mean that these metals and alloys should be able to endure high temperature and radiation, which is typical inside these power engines and plants. For designing such materials, we need to look into the factors such as the presence of defects into these materials, which greatly influence this degradation process of materials over time. So right now, a great amount of effort is being put to analyze these defects in materials. Researchers in material science domain are conducting experiments in a highly sophisticated setup, collecting data and then analyzing this data manually. By manually, I mean by visual inspection. So this analysis by visual inspection is limited by our ability to perceive change after a certain limit. So human eye cannot really perceive too small change with this naked eye. Also, since the data are very noisy and comes into huge amount, it takes a long time to actually even partially analyze this data, even for expert researchers. We have seen that the data generated from just a 1 hour experiment could take up to like 3 months to thoroughly analyze them. So our goal in our research, we aim to automate this annotation and analysis of this huge amount of data with the constraint that we want to minimize these inputs from the human experts. We also want this system to be reliable and efficient enough so that we can actually replace much of the manual analysis process that's happening right now. So our work is still a work in progress, but I could show some preliminary results from our work. As you can see in this graph, from a high level, you can think of this graph as showing the change in the size of defects in a material over time. As you can see by the cyan line that we have, which is representing the output from our system, we can, with our system, capture the evolution of these defects dynamics in a more detailed compared to this manual measurement that's being shown as like the more or less like piecewise straight line, the red straight line. With this system in place, we're actually able to discover a new physical phenomena. That's you can see the ups and downs in this curve, which was not previously noticed. So previously, we would like only sample few amount of points to do the measurement, and then we kind of get like a monotonic curve instead of this observing these fluctuations. Also, like
you have 1 more minute.
Yeah, thank you. Also, because these changes are pretty small and pretty rapid, so human eye could not detect this. So it is kind of like our black hole imaging moment, like we could discover this physical phenomena using machine learning. We are hoping to publish the details of this system soon. So to summarize, we need sustainable materials to ensure a clean energy future with modern power plants. We also need to design and analyze efficiently these materials. Our work in our research, we aim to design tools and algorithms to make this research computationally more efficient and accelerate scientific discovery, like the one that I just showed you. Thank you all for listening. If you have any question, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Thanks, Nasim. Any questions? Okay, if not, our next speakers are Anurag Saharoy and Rosny Viswas from Wikilimo, and they'll present Deep Jeff, forecasting wildfire danger and spread with deep learning.
Hi, I'm Roshni. I hope you all are able to see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. My name is Roshni, and today I'll be talking about Deep Jeff, our project on improving current forecasting capabilities of wildfire danger and spread using a deep learning approach. So I don't need to say this, but wildfires are severely dangerous and have been increasing over the past couple of years due to the warming climate. The basis of our study is kind of understanding better what the necessary conditions are that cause wildfires and how can we kind of predict and prevent these from occurring. Fire danger is measured using various indices currently. The two that I'll be focusing on today are the Fire Weather Index and Fire Radiative Power. These indices are standard, used across the world by various fire danger teams and government agencies, and when kind of plotted out on a global map, they give a severity rating for a fire. So as we can see here, the colors, lighter colors are fires having low danger, and the dark colors have more extreme danger. And what this physically means is an FWI rated fire having a rating of 15 is far less severe than one with a higher rating. What FRP signifies is more of an ongoing fire and the kind of energy that's emitted from it. So how these indices are calculated are using weather readings. These are readings taken from the ground or remotely sensed from satellites. And FWI has an underlying calculation that you can see over here, incorporates air temperature, humidity, wind speed, and rainfall, and produces kind of a rating ranging from 0 to something that can go even above 50, representing how severe the fire is. And NFRP, on the other hand, is an observed value for how much energy is radiated from an ongoing fire. As you can see in this representation, it's a modus observation, and we can see what the actively burning fires are looking like from a range of 0 to up to 22,000. Yeah, so our project goals are being able to predict these FWI and FRP values and improving the prediction. So there are current systems that already predict these values, but how can we improve them on the basis of the level of accuracy, on the basis of time scale? And what I mean by time scale is currently we can see kind of the prediction for the next 8 to 10 days, but how can we get longer term predictions maybe for the next month or for the next season? And that's kind of what our machine learning model is built to do. Next up, we want to study the correlation of additional variables. The current system only incorporates the 4 weather forcings, which are, as I said earlier, temperature, humidity, rainfall, and wind speed. But are there new variables that are remotely sensed from the latest satellites that we can incorporate into the model to improve these predictions? And lastly, how can we better model fire spread dynamics, meaning once the fire is ignited and is persisting, in what direction and at what speed is it moving? So these are the kind of goals that we set out to explore. And now I'll talk about the results. We have some very exciting results, although the work is currently still in progress. This is the machine learning model that was developed. It's essentially a U-Net style model repurposed into a regression task. Model is trained on historical data for the last over a year, and we take as input the forcings variables that I mentioned earlier, and the model spits out the label that we have used here is FWI, which is projected on a global map. And here I've zoomed into just one of the case studies that we studied, which was the fire season in Australia in 2019. As you can see here is the 10-day prediction plot going from the first day of prediction to T+10. And our accuracy has kind of lies between the range of 80 to 90, which is great. And it successfully reproduces the accuracy range that we already have using current systems. This is more of a visual demonstration of a time lapse of what this would look like, say if we were trying to predict FWI value for the next 10 to 15 days and how it would kind of vary at different ranges. Yeah. We also explored increasing the time scale. So we tried out several experiments kind of during inference. The model takes in, say, the input values of forcings for the previous 3 to 4 days, and then spits out FWI or FRP rating for the next 10 days. And then we tried increasing these. So this is a prediction of taking input of 7 days and then predicting for the next 21 days, which is considerable increase in the time scale. And as you can see here, the accuracy still is quite high, ranging from about 75 to 80, even though the model was only trained on 6 months of data for 30 epochs. And this can be, this is very promising and can be improved quite a bit if trained on more data and with more time. Next goal was to add more additional variables. So we tried out 3 additional variables that I'm going to talk about here: leaf area index, volumetric soil water, and land skin temperature. So what these mean are leaf area index is basically kind of a unit of the greenness or the amount of leaves per unit land. And the reason we thought this would be important was this represents like the kind of burnable biomass matter that's available for the fire to burn on. But we realized that this does not significantly contribute to increasing the accuracy, probably because there's a lag in this vegetative matter being cured into actual burnable matter. So that's for LAI. The next variable was volumetric soil water. This is the amount of moisture present in the first level of soil. This did increase our accuracies 65% as compared to the original 4 forcings variables. And lastly, we also added land skin temperature, which is like a measurement of the temperature of the surface of the Earth taken at a particular distance from the surface. And this also did increase our global accuracies with about 68% accuracy. Next, I'm going to be talking about kind of like a more nuanced approach to looking at these results. So we decided to bin these ratings. This is a plot where we've binned it into 3 different divisions, FWI values from 0 to 15, 15 to 70, and 70 and above. And this seems to be very insightful because we can see that fires that have more higher danger rating are predicted less accurately compared to smaller, less dangerous fires. And this is a problem, and this happens because our training data is available more for smaller fires rather than bigger fires, because bigger fires are not as, don't happen as frequently. So when we train on 1 year of data, the model tends to see kind of less of the larger, more extreme fires, but more of these smaller events, and hence predicts the smaller fires better. But what we need it to predict better are the actual larger fires. So this is the problem that we're still trying to resolve. This is another plot where we've benchmarked our machine learning predictions with existing numerical predictions that were, and this is binned with a different classification scheme, binned at 5 levels also in the range of 0 to 50. And we can see here that our predictions are at par with or even better than numerical predictions that are currently existing. So this is also one of the results that we're super proud of. Challenges we've faced. So as I talked about earlier, the data that we're training on is extremely left skewed and is very long-tailed, as you can see. So this is the reason why the model is not being able to predict the more severe fires, because it actually hasn't seen enough of them. So we've tried
Rosni, you have 1 more minute.
Okay, thank you. So we try to combat this using various data transformation techniques, class balance loss, undersampling, trying to figure out how, or just train on more data, trying to figure out what would improve levels of higher accuracy more. As I said, this is currently a work in progress. So the next steps would be predicting fire ignition and modeling fire spread dynamics. So predicting ignition is a problem because like about 10 to 15% wildfires are actually ignited due to, like naturally ignited due to conditions from weather and climate patterns, but about 80% are due to human activity. So it's harder to predict those kind of fires. The kind of variables that we would look into for predicting a naturally occurring fire would be lightning, and we don't have a variable that would integrate that at this moment. So we're currently exploring different data sets or products that can help these integrate these kind of fires factors into the prediction. And next up, we are also going to explore reinforcement learning approaches to better model the spread dynamics and see how the presence of burnable biomass or adjacent grids in fire can help us see which direction or at what speed the fire is moving. Key takeaways, well, I guess, yes, we were able to kind of reproduce the currently existing system, so yay, and we are able to improve the global accuracies, which is also awesome. The timescales of prediction have been improved to a certain extent. We go from, say, 10 days to maybe 21 days at this point of time, but we are still yet to see how we can kind of seasonally forecast these fires. And lastly, incorporation of additional variables has somewhat boosted prediction, but we're yet to determine exactly what the correlation between these factors are and how they're related and what their relative importances are. This is an open source project, so all the code base and documentation is available on GitHub. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to Anurag and I over email, or happy to answer some questions right now.
Hey, Roshni, this is Nick. Really interesting work. Thanks for the talk. I'm curious, does it vary, like I know it's more static, but does a variable like the tree canopies, like how much variation there is in the height of the tree canopy matter? I've heard like just anecdotally that if you have a forest where the tree canopy is pretty much all at the same level, you would expect the fire to spread a lot more rapidly than when it varies.
Right. So hi Nicholas, I'm Anurag. So there are two particular variables to look at. One is leaf area index at a high vegetation and leaf area index at a low vegetation. So I think low vegetation is what is more at the ground level. So bushes, shrubs, and all of these, whereas leaf area index high vegetation is at the higher level, the tree canopy. The problem with either of these is that because this is green biomass, it is still not yet ready to burn. So when we include this as a variable in the system, it does not really affect the accuracies as much because green biomass doesn't burn. So there is a certain lag that we need to take into account that, yes, of course, you need the biomass for it to burn, but this biomass, only when it exists, let's say 35 days from now, then it will contribute to a big fire. So yeah, the level of the vegetation probably does matter, but I think an even bigger factor is how cured this biomass is for burning.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Anurag and Rosni. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, if not, our next speaker is Minghao Qiu from MIT, and the talk that Minghao is going to give is statistical and machine learning methods for evaluating emissions reduction policies on air quality under changing meteorological conditions.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Minghao. I'm a PhD student at MIT. First of all, I just want to also say thank you to the organizers to have such a wonderful platform for all of us. For my presentation today, I'm going to talk about how can we use statistical and machine learning methods to evaluate air pollution policy under meteorological conditions. So, the object I study, ambient air pollution, is of interest to many of us because it is really a global threat to human life. So what I'm showing on the figure is the risk factors for human mortality for both 1990 and 2015. And you can see what I highlight here is the ambient particulate matter pollution, which is the tiny particulate matter that's suspended in the air, which people got familiar with in the Western coast because of wildfire this year. So they are very harmful to the human health. So there are estimates that globally the particulate matter with diameter less than 2.5 microns, PM2.5, is responsible for 4 million mortalities. And another kind of pollutants which we care about, ozone, is responsible for about 700,000 deaths. So with this motivation, people are interested in all kinds of measures that can reduce air pollution. And one of the most recent interesting examples is COVID. So what I'm showing you here is a satellite image of the NO2 concentration, which is another source of air pollution over the Europe continent by the satellite images. On the top, you have March to April in 2019, and on the bottom, you have the same period for year 2020. And what we see is there is a significant drop in a lot of this pollutants, especially over those mega cities. But the key problems, and the people have hypothesized that that is because of the COVID, there are lockdown measures, people stop drive cars a lot more, stop going to a lot of other activities that has some impacts on the air pollution. But the really interesting question is how much of this drop is really due to COVID-related lockdowns. And not only about COVID, but also for other kinds of air pollution control policies. When you implement the policy, people want to know if what they see, if they see an improvement in air quality, if that actually due to the policy. This is of course pretty difficult because on one hand, you have policy or a shock like COVID that influence emissions and then translate to observed changes in air quality. But on the other hand, you also have meteorological variability that could influence air quality. And of course, that has nothing to do with your emission control policy or COVID. So for instance, how can we not, how is the case that you see a minus 54% in Paris? Is that really due to COVID, or is that because Paris in 2020 is rainier than in 2019? So looking at the literature, there is really very little investigation on what methods one should be used to correct for meteorological variability. And when there's no consensus, people go for the things that are simpler. So majority of the literature use simple linear regression type of work or MLR model to do that. So in a concrete example, so this is a recent paper look at how lockdown influenced air quality. And so they have some kind of regression model like this. On the left-hand side, you have the air quality. And then this is a causal parameter that the research is interested in. It's a dummy variable, whether there's lockdown or not. And the beta is the causal parameter they're really interested in. There are some fixed effects in the model. They know that there are meteorological variability going on here, but what they do is they simply include a linear combination of meteorological variables, such as temperature, precipitation, and hope that this could capture this meteorological confoundness from that. The problem is, however, that people use all this kind of models, but they are seldomly evaluated against a true policy effect. And to be fair, this is pretty hard because we never got to know the counterfactual, right? We never know what the air quality in Europe in 2020 would look like if the meteorology happens to be the 2019 case. So in this work, what we do is we will simulate a counterfactual with the full complexity atmospheric chemistry models. And then we ask, how do the policy signals assessed under different type of regression or machine learning models, how do they compare with the simulated counterfactual signals? and what is the best available statistical approach to do such task, and what is the model's performance. In a nutshell, what we find is the simple linear regression framework is not very do not perform very well, and it sometimes could be even worse than if you don't do any correction on meteorology at all. The best, among the methods we try, the machine learning model implemented with random forest using both local and synoptic scale meteorological features significantly help reduce the bias, but the bias actually remain significant. So let me talk a little about the methods we use. So first is this full complexity atmospheric chemistry model. So the idea is that, so if you can look at the map, the idea is that the model simply divides the Earth into a three-dimensional cube, both vertically and horizontal. And within each cube, they solve tens of thousands differential equations that characterize the physical chemistry of the atmosphere. And then they could sort of give you the simulation of the concentration of different pollutants. What's important about this is you can think about this as simply a combination between meteorological fields and emissions. And with one combination of that, you get one set of the concentration value out of that. So with this model, we do the model experiment as such. So we will simulate two sets of scenarios. One set of scenarios is the observed scenario, which includes real changing emissions and real meteorology. That is just a proxy to what we observe in the real world. And then there's the counterfactual scenario that includes the real emissions, but with a constant meteorology. So therefore, in the counterfactual scenario, this is what you hope to get. There is no meteorological variability in this case, and you can simply calculate or estimate a real policy effect. And in our case, we'll focus on the causal parameters be a linear trend. But you don't got to observe the counterfactual scenario. What you have is the observed scenario with the meteorological variability. So what we do is we will try different kind of statistical approaches on that to correct for the meteorological variability and compare the estimate effects to the simulated counterfactual. Again, the case study we'll look at is the 7-year trend in PM 2.5 and ozone in the US from 2011 to 2017. To be a little more concrete, what we do is we will fit the following model on the daily data for each grid cell, which is about 50 by 60 kilometers large. So the thing we care about is this beta term, which is the meteorologic corrected trend. There will be fixed effects, but really what's really matter for this is how you specify your meteorologic correction, right? What I'm showing here, this is the MR model that you have a linear combination of different meteorological variables, but we will also try replace these terms with different kind of characterizations of meteorology controls. And this is evaluated against a standard set of meteorological features, including wind speed, surface temperature, precipitation, humidity, etc. So I think it's also important to note very briefly why we actually need machine learning in such case. And the idea is that from the literature of air pollution, we know there's a strong spatial dependency in air pollution. So one place air quality is not only influenced by this place meteorology, but it could potentially be influenced by the meteorology of places really further away from that. So to sort of export on the spatial dependency, we need to expand the set of candidate variables or set of features. And that's where machine learning become really helpful compared to some of the standard regression techniques. And by the way, we follow the double machine, and also this is a causal inference question combined with the machine learning approach. So we follow this literature from Victor Chernozhukov from MIT. I'm happy to talk more if you are interested in that.
Ingo, you have 1 more minute.
Great, thanks. So in the last minute, I'll just briefly go through some of the results. So what I'm showing here is the meteorology corrected trend for ozone in Midwest in the US, estimated by different methods. So on the first row, this is the simulated ground truth from the chemistry model. And if you do no correction on this, then your estimates will be really biased from the true model. And the linear model is actually even worse. And when the bias reduces when you use a more flexible, complicated model. And really the game changer is when you use machine learning and combine this with both local and synaptic scale features. You have a slightly different story for PM 2.5 in the sense that the estimates are not very biased from the true even in the first place, but you still gain some accuracy by using machine learning type of models. This is my last slide. So this is still work in progress. What we know that is even with the best perform approach, we still have pretty large bias. I'm showing a median bias 38% for ozone and 26% for PM 2.5. And I'm showing on the map is how they look at spatially. And there seems to be some pattern that even with flexi models such as random forest, you can still not fully capture that meteorological variability. And we are looking into that. And if you have any idea how you can one can dig deep into the random forest model to know better why this model gives one performance or another, I will be really happy to hear about that. With that, I'll have on the conclusion slide, and thanks for your time and take any questions.
Thanks. We have any questions?